Welcome to MasterMind Minutes, the podcast that focuses on the franchise industry. We'll cover topics that are important to franchisees as well as franchisors and share interesting insights that will help you build your business. We have one guest, we ask one question, and we do this in minutes, not hours. Hello again, and welcome to another edition of MasterMind Minutes. My name is Gary Occhiogrosso. I'm the founder of Franchise Growth Solutions and the publisher of FranchiseMoneymaker.com. For those of you who may be listening to Mastermind Minutes for the first time, the concept is simple. We have one guest, we have one topic or one question, and we get an answer, and we do it in minutes and not hours. And that's basically the idea and the premise of the show. Today, my guest is Victor Turcanu, who is a leading franchise attorney with Tannenbaum and Helburn. And Victor brings a wealth of international franchise experience to the table, having advised franchisors across a wide range of industries, from tech startups to home services to food and beverage brands, which I have worked with Victor on. He is licensed to practice in both Canada and the United States, and he specializes in strategic guidance for emerging and established franchise systems navigating the complex regulatory landscape of North America's two largest franchising markets, that being the U.S. and Canada. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But first, let me say hello to Victor. Thank you for being with us today. I truly appreciate it. We know each other now, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years and done a lot of business together. Before we get into the question, why don't you tell the audience a little bit more about Victor? And I know I butchered your name, I'm sorry, about Victor, and tell us a little bit more about the firm and what you guys do in the franchise industry, and then we'll get into the question.
Yeah, no problem. Gary, happy to be here as always. And it's been a pleasure working with you over all these years. And I won't hold the name pronunciation against you. So don't worry about it. So I mean, I'm an attorney. I'm a franchise attorney. I sort of grew up in the corporate and M&A space, and just so happened that most of my clients ended up being in franchising. I primarily represent franchisors. I started my career out in Canada. I practiced there for a number of years. I moved to the United States not too long ago, and now I focus my practice exclusively on U.S. franchise law. But I have a background in practicing in Canada and doing a lot of cross-border franchising deals over the years. So, I'd say probably about half, if not more, of my practice right now actually focuses on assisting non-U.S. franchise systems at entering the United States, and certainly, vice versa, helping U.S. franchisors expand outside of the United States, and sort of the intricacies and compliance requirements that go into doing that. As for the firm, we're a sort of small to mid-sized full-service firm in New York City. We're about maybe 50 to 60 lawyers at any given time here, and I'm one of the franchise attorneys here at the firm. And we support franchisors throughout the life cycle of their business, and that means everything from starting the franchise and forming the concept to helping clients through their exit, right? Through actually generating that ROI on their enterprise, right? So it's a wide ranging practice. We're general counsel for a number of franchise systems at this stage, and things have been going quite well, I'd say.
Great. So from in the world of franchising, then in Tannenbaum and Helburn, I mean, you're doing everything from writing franchise disclosure documents to guidance along the way, perhaps helping them with franchise advisory councils, giving counsel on handling rogue franchisees. I mean, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, there's the whole franchise compliance piece, right? Which is, franchise disclosure documents and state registrations, and yes, preparing franchise agreements and multi-unit agreements and everything that goes into actually selling franchises. But yes, providing general advisory services. Sometimes there are issues, right? I mean, you're growing a franchise system. There's a lot that goes into it. If there's ever a dispute, or if there's, sometimes franchisors need to take on investment from outside parties, right? So we help them on that front as well. Maybe there's employment issues that come up, right? So it's a wide ranging practice, and we have the expertise in house here to really sort of focus on anything that a franchisor.
That's great, because a lot of my experience has been, I can't say for the world, but my experience has been that a lot of franchise law firms, like they only do like one thing. Like they will only write franchise agreement, like that's all they do. They get involved in FTDs, and Everything else is they just somewhere, whether it's trademark or litigation, it just goes somewhere else. Okay. So let's get into the question because I think it's an interesting topic and it's about your background. And it's certainly a topic that I run into a lot with our clients. You know, Franchise Growth Solutions, as you know, I mean, we deal primarily with startups and emerging brands. And one of the things that comes up sometimes too early on in the process is, hey, we got this guy that called us from Canada. Can we franchise in Canada or in Mexico or, not just in North America? We do a lot of food franchises. So, hey, they want us to open in Dubai. We get a lot of Dubai. Okay. Get a lot
Right.
of. So I think the question really is layered, okay? And I think it the first part of it would be what are the sort of yellow flags? I don't want to say red flags, but what are the yellow flags that a franchisor should be cautious about or thinking about when they either want to take their American concept? Let's use Canada as example. Let's from US to Canada, or if they're a Canadian franchisor from Canada to the United States. And then I guess sort of the sub question to that is when is the right time? So let's focus on sort of what's the, beware of dog, like what do we have to worry about if we
Right.
want to go international?
Right. Yeah. So it's a very interesting question, and I think there is no one size fits all answer because as you know, every franchisor, every franchise system has a different growth trajectory, right? Some grow faster, some grow slower, some are a little bit more strategic, and it really depends on what the founder's goal is at the end of the day as well, right? I mean, you look at your concept and you say, hey, do I feel that this concept would do really well in another country, and there are a lot of interest? Then that's something that you have to consider, right? But I would say in most situations, right, from a business standpoint, if you're a U.S. brand, I mean, you got a country with what is it, 400 million people, give or take now. I mean, we're talking about a significant potential growth opportunity here in the U.S. So I've had clients that come to me and they said, hey, I have, 3 or 4 locations in the U.S. I've gotten a lead from Canada or from the United Kingdom or whatever to expand internationally. Should I do it? And I say, well, how are you possibly going to support that franchisee in Canada if you barely cracked the surface in the United States, right? Do you really want to go through the exact same process that you just went through to start franchising in a different country, right? And again, aside from the legal piece, which we can talk about, right? There's an operational issue here, right? I mean, especially in food, I mean, you got to be thinking about supply chains, setting up a local supply chain, especially if it's overseas. Canada may be a simple example, right? But if you have interest in Dubai and you're based in New York, I mean, how are you going to set that element up, right? So that there's an entire conversation around whether operationally it's even feasible, right, to go and expend the resources and the time necessary to expand outside of the country, right? And then on the legal side, which is really what we spend most of our time doing, is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak, right? Is it really worth your while to go and in Canada you have to go and get yourself a Canadian FDD, for instance, right? Which mirrors the US FDD by about 25 to 30%, right? But the Canadian franchise disclosure is a legal document in its own right. Australia has the same concept. Mexico has a similar concept, right? South Korea, I'm doing a deal right now in South Korea where we have to put together a South Korean FDD because we're selling the master rights to that territory, right? So, we're always attuned to the question of whether it's actually necessary or whether it's actually worthwhile proceeding, right? And especially in this climate, with the current political climate and trade restrictions and tariffs and everything else that's going on, it's become so important to be intentional about international expansion rather than simply opportunistic. Just
Yeah.
because you get a lead, right, that says, hey, I want to open up a single, burger shop in the United Kingdom, you're probably better off waiting, right? And you yourself making the decision and being intentional about, hey, we're actually going to build in that expansion to Europe into our long-term growth plan, right? And being intentional about it when the time actually comes.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. You used a word here in your explanation just a minute ago. You used the word necessary, and I can tell you, some of my clients don't like the way I talk. I'm just maybe a bit too New York. There's absolutely no reason for a franchise company with 3 units or 5 units or 10 units to be thinking about opening up in Dubai, other than to schmooze the ego of the founder. Okay, I mean that's the truth. Okay, it's absolutely unnecessary. Um, because as you mentioned, there's nearly 400 million people in the United States. It's vast. You can do thousands and thousands of units in the United States. The other issue, again, we do a lot of restaurants, as you know. Supply chain is a huge problem, and we brought and you were on this case with us. We brought a concept from Canada to the U.S. and they now have paused their franchising because they had supply chain issues because they were bringing everything in through Canada into the United States. And the challenge not only was the sort of the logistics of it, but the challenge was the cost of what did it layer on cost that the franchisees here in the United States, their cost of goods, which is important in any business, but in the restaurant business is sort of the heartbeat, their cost of goods was 5, 6, 8% higher than it was for their franchisees in Canada. And that 5, 6, 8% could be the difference between making money in a restaurant and not making money in a restaurant. And the franchisor, unfortunately, didn't think about this in the future, or in advance is what I meant to say, and it created all sorts of problems. So again, I never think it's necessary to go to Dubai or Canada or Mexico until you fill out your U.S. plan. Now, I will say this: if you're in Canada, coming into the US, that's a different story because the market in Canada is tiny compared to the market in the United States. That doesn't mean it isn't without problems. However, I think the upside is far more greater if you're a Canadian franchisor coming into the US than a US franchisor going into Canada. So I'm sure you've seen all sorts of hiccups and problems. What are some of the problems that you've seen where franchisors have failed miserably, maybe not even so miserably, just failed. Like, what's the friction? You mentioned supply chain, but there's got to be other issues.
Yeah, so supply chain is certainly one of them, and on the Canadian piece specifically. By the way, Canada, by my last count, is like the second largest franchise market in the world, right? And it's very small
That's
compared to
amazing. It has a small population, relatively speaking.
40 some million people, 41, 42, I think at the last count. But again, it's a relatively mature franchise market compared to
Yeah,
other
yeah,
parts
yeah,
of the world, but
yeah.
it's still like an eighth or a tenth of the size of the United States. And for a lot of Canadian brands, coming into the United States and expanding into this country is, it's sort of the be all end all. It's where you want to end up, right? Because then you've really made it as a franchisor if you can make it in the United States. But to your question, what are the hiccups? What are the biggest obstacles aside from the supply chain piece? Again, expanding too early, right? If you can't make it in Canada, if you haven't gotten a critical mass of franchisees where you've proven out a system in your home country, how are you possibly going to do it in the United States, right? There's a significant financial investment
Yeah.
associated with complying with franchise laws and setting up a system in the United States. How are you going to train these franchisees if you don't have any stores in the U.S., right? And you plan on franchising from your home country. I mean, a lot of franchisees, especially the sophisticated multi-unit guys that we have here in the United States, they want to see a proof of concept in Canada, right? Or in the United States, rather. You don't have an item 19 necessarily, right? Because you don't have U.S. sales, right? So, these are all challenges that any foreign franchisor is going to face, right? Which is typically why my advice has often been, look, you can do it, right? You can come straight in, but, be prepared to face questions around whether or not this is truly a viable business model for the U.S.
Mm.
And, and again, maybe the answer is we set up a corporate location. Maybe we do a joint venture or two first with an operating partner, right? Where we sort of set something up, we sort of adapt our system to the local market, right? So that we can make sure that, hey, once we're actually ready to hit the ground franchising and, we start working with Gary and he starts to sell franchises for us, well, at least we've hit the ground running and we know what the model is that has been localized to the United States, right? The other piece that I often recommend is, okay, well, if you're coming from a market that's wildly different than the US, right? I'm not talking about Canada, right? I'm saying, maybe you're like an Asian concept, right?
Hmm.
that your concept works in Asia or in Australia, but you have no idea whether it's directly translatable to North America. You know, maybe you're better off relying on a local party to do it for you, like a master franchisee or an
Mhm.
area representative at the very least, somebody who knows the market and who can sort of take the concept, who has the wherewithal to be able to adapt it to the United States and to this franchise market, right? So it's a lot easier to do that than to do it yourself, to put boots on the ground in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up a couple of really good points. First of all, I agree with you. I think that's a very prudent approach when you talk about maybe you open a company store in the market, maybe you do it with an operating partner, get proof of concept. I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, back in this was in the 90s, I launched a chicken sandwich concept. I didn't launch it. I launched the franchise with the founders of the company, and we grew well, and we grew rapidly, and we did a again, uh, we sold the company to a private equity firm, and someone from China, when I say China, Taiwan, decided they wanted to bring the concept there, and they were experienced operator. And of course we did the deal. We were like enamored, like, oh, wow, you know. I
Right.
do remember the founder of the company telling me this, because we were based in New York. He hated the idea. But at that point, he had sold the company at a small piece. And when that happens, the founder of the company is usually the pebble in everybody's shoe. Okay. But in this particular case, he was spot on. He said
Right.
to me, he kind of like grabbed me by the shoulder or by the elbow. He said, I don't understand. Why are we opening in China? We haven't even opened up in Chinatown yet in New York. Why are we opening in China? Okay.
It's a good question.
Great question, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because we know nothing about this, because we know absolutely nothing about this. Well, here's what we found out. We found out, number one, that in Taipei, the populace uses what we would call a fast food or a quick service restaurant. They use it more as like a sit down restaurant. So we couldn't build an 800 square foot store. We had to build a 2,000, 3,000 square foot store, which trying to find space like that in a city like Taipei is near impossible. And it's
Right.
outrageously expensive. So the numbers didn't work. The other thing we found out was, while we were pushing the idea that we were selling boneless, skinless, never frozen, all white meat chicken breast chicken sandwiches in Asia and in Taipei. I can't speak for all of Asia, but in Taipei, and me too, by the way, they don't like white meat chicken breast. They
Right.
like dark meat. So
Right.
now we had to like convert over to like sliced chicken thighs, which a chicken thigh, as you know, is this big, and a chicken breast could be this big. And the challenge was the chicken thigh didn't fit the bun. I'm giving you like this is true, but it sounds crazy. But this was a huge problem for us, because when we got there, we couldn't help the franchisee. We were
That-
at a loss. And they
but
were
this
looking
is
at us like, you guys took our money, and now you can't help us. Now
see,
we're the
this is
guys
what
that
I
kind of
mean.
figure it out.
Yeah, this is what I mean. I mean, this is what we're talking about, localizing and adapting the system to the local market. You can't just assume that what works here is going to work anywhere else in the world. I mean, and by the way, we go back to Canada. I mean, the same is even true in Canada, right? I mean, we're like literally it's a 7 hour drive north of here. Like it's not that far, very similar market. But you can't simply go into it blind thinking, oh, it's going gangbusters in the United States. We're just going to automatically assume that's going to work everywhere else. Because what if it doesn't? Then all of a sudden, you've just spent all this time and money and energy trying to sell franchises and grow your system in a different country, right? And it blows up in your face, right? Take the time. Like I said, be intentional about it, right? Do your market research. Find a local party that actually understands local consumer preferences, right? Do that work up front. It's going to save you a ton of headache down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is why I'm pretty vehement about the idea that it's an unnecessary step for a
Right.
startup or an emerging brand. I mean, it sounds good, it's an ego schmooze, and sometimes these guys, and I want to talk about this for a couple of minutes, sometimes these buyers, these master franchisee buyers, they're willing to write big checks. So
Right.
sometimes, it's, hey, do I really want to turn down a $250,000 upfront fee? Now, sometimes, by the way, the money is great, obviously, but sometimes it's because they want to bring that cash in, and other times it's because the franchisor needs that cash, which is another red flag, and that's probably
Uh-huh.
another conversation for another program, Victor, that we'll
Right.
have. But what I want to talk about here is when we're talking about the investment on the Zor side to get into a different country. And I've done some international deals, so I know different countries have different rules. So, for example, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, in some countries, I don't know what countries, but I'm just going to say some countries, you need to have your FDD. It's almost like in the US, you need to have an FDD, you need to have local counsel, and you need to have all of that up front before you actually are engaged in the franchise offering process with that person who wants to be your master franchisee. Then there are countries that don't have any of that. And you could give them your USFDD because you want to be a nice guy, and you just have the attorney write the master franchise agreement, and you're good to go. And then you got countries that are kind of in the middle. And there's three for me. There may be more, but for me, there's these three buckets. There's the wild, wild west countries, do what you want. There's the countries that are like the U.S. And then in the middle, there are these countries that do require an FDD and the other stuff. However, you're allowed to, and I've done this several times, did this in Saudi Arabia, you're allowed to collect a non-refundable deposit when a term sheet is done, and the franchisor can use that money to get the FDD done and hire local counsel. And if the master guy doesn't want to do it or backs out, they lose their deposit, but it hasn't cost the Zor money out of their pocket to get ready. So talk to me a little bit about what should a franchisor expect in terms of cost and time based on those three scenarios. Obviously, the wild, wild west one is simple, but the
Yeah.
other two do require money.
Right. So you're absolutely right. It is so case dependent, right? And I think, those three buckets are generally right. I mean, I have a lot of these discussions with a lot of clients where they say, "Hey, I want to go. I've gotten a lead from the UAE or from Saudi Arabia or from Canada or from wherever." I once had a client who asked me about doing a deal in Guyana, right? Guyana does not, to my knowledge, have franchise specific laws. But even in a situation like that, I mean, we actually, in that case, I think we actually simply use their US FTD, but we just had local counsel in Guyana review it for discrete points of Guyanese law to make sure that the agreement was enforceable. We're talking about a few sections that had to be amended to make sure that it was sufficiently localized to Guyana. But contrast that example at one end of the spectrum to certainly to the U.S. obviously, but Saudi Arabia is another example, right? Like you said, in Saudi Arabia, and I did one of these recently. The advice from our local counsel in Saudi Arabia was, yeah, you can actually collect a deposit up front to cover the franchisor's legal expenses so that they're not out of pocket if the deal doesn't go through. And that works really well, right? In Canada, right? And especially when I used to practice there, not really something you could do, right? Because you can't collect money from a franchisee in Canada, like in the United States, until you sent them an FDD and waited at least 14 days. So, this is why it's so important to make sure you have a clear picture of the country you're entering into, right? It's not a reactive response to getting a lead. It's a proactive response to going and actually soliciting and offering franchises in the foreign country, right? And again, it goes back to this thing that I tell all my clients: be intentional about it. Just because somebody expresses interest on your website doesn't mean that you need to go and start, engaging with them, because maybe the time isn't right. And I don't know that you have, the interest or the time and the money necessary to go and put together a Canadian FDD or a Saudi FDD or an Australian FDD or a South Korean FDD, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
So, just we're almost at the end here, but I do want to ask this question. So, you personally, professionally, your firm, look, there are some attorneys that you ask them for a product and they'll deliver the product. Then there are other attorneys that, yes, they'll deliver the product, but they'll also give you the counsel around it. So if I'm a franchisor and I want to go to Canada and I come to your firm and I'm knock on the door of Tannenbaum and Helbron and I say, "Oh, Victor, hey, I want to go to Canada." Are you going, okay, well, write your FDD and everything else, or are you going to give me sort of the, hey, let's talk about that first speech, okay?
It serves nobody's purpose. And this is my philosophy of practice. I'm happy to take people's money and do legal work, but at the end of the day, it is not worth my while and it's not worth the client's while to do that unless there's actually going to be a light at the end of the tunnel, which is selling franchises and scaling, right? Where I want to be is I want to be there when the client has actually successfully entered Canada and they've done their 100th or their 200th deal in that country and they've saturated that market, right? Because that's what this is all about. That's what this entire relationship in this entire industry is all about.
Yep.
So my approach to any question, whether it's around U.S. expansion or international expansion, is hang on before we put pen to paper on anything. Before we start to to cut down trees and prepare FDDs and franchise agreements and corporate documents and all that. Let's have a discussion as to what are the business outcomes that you want here. What is the actual goal? How does this fit into your long-term plan to scale your business? And is this truly the right thing for you to be doing at this time, right? Because the answer may be yes, but the answer may also be no, right? Because again, to go back to the example earlier, if you've got 10 units in the United States and you've got all this white space, right, where you can go and you can sell a bunch of franchises and scale, to 400 units in the United States, you're already set up. You're already here. You know the market here. Why not focus on that, right? Why split your brain and your operations and try to do this everywhere else in the world, right? So franchising is really, it's about walking before we run in many instances,
Yep.
right? You got to walk, you got to be strategic, and it's a long game. I mean, we're talking about 5, 10, 15 years of development before you get to the point where you've truly perhaps seen the ROI on the investment that you've made, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm going to give you a minute to think about your last thoughts on the topic while I just sort of underscore something that you just said that we use a lot in our company. We call it working with the end in mind. And I think you said what's the business outcome? I think if you ask someone that question and they can't answer it like immediately, I mean immediately, they're probably not ready to do anything, let alone international franchising. So, with all of this being said, any final thought you want to give, like a lot of our audiences, franchisors, any final thought, advice, tip, whatever you want to give to the audience on the topic of international franchising?
Yeah. My, my overarching advice is take it slow, be strategic. It takes time to grow a franchise system. It takes time to grow a franchise system domestically in the US. It takes even more time to grow a franchise system outside the United States. I've said it again, and I'll keep saying it. You can't be opportunistic, right? You can't just say, oh, somebody's interested in opening up in, China, right? Let's go and do a Chinese FDD, right? And let's sell a franchise system, a franchise in China when you've barely done anything in the United States and you have so much opportunity here, right? So it's about being strategic. It's about being intentional. It's about keeping your eye on the prize, right? Certainly being flexible at the same time and understanding that, the economy changes, the market changes, consumer preferences change, but also build a good team around you, right? I mean, yes, I'm a lawyer, but at the end of the day, we only see one piece of the puzzle here, right? We only have visibility on one dimension of our client's business, which is their legal needs, right? Make sure you have the right sales team in place. Make sure you have the right operations team in place. Make sure if you are going to do the international thing, right, and expand outside of the United States, make sure you have somebody who understands that foreign market. Don't assume that it's just going to work because you already did it in the US, right? So build the right team in place, be intentional, be strategic, and take things slow.
Yeah, no, I love it. I wrote it down. So I love just those three sort of pillars. Be strategic, be intentional, be flexible.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to end this topic here. All right, Victor, somebody wants to get in touch with you or they want to reach out to Tenenbaum and Helbrin. What is there a website? What do they do? And again,
Yeah,
we'll
so our
we'll post the link. We'll post the link in the bio of the program.
so our website is thsh.com. That's Tenenbaum Helpern. So it's thsh, those 4 letters.com. And my email address, if anybody wants to reach me, is vturcanu, that's VTURCANU, @thsh.com.
Okay. Great. Well, listen, man, I thank you for taking the time. This is long overdue, but I thank you for taking the time. We have not. This is the first in 5 years that we've covered the topic of international franchising. So I know there's a lot more to it. So we'll have to have you come back. But it's always good to see you, and I truly, truly appreciate the time that you gave us today, and I'm sure the audience does also.
Always a pleasure, Gary. Anytime.